Hello and most welcome to 1541, and we are presently by the Jonsered factory area built by the Scottish-British industrial William Gibson in the late 19th century, early 20th century. It's a marvelous area, and we're just taking a nip of the last sunlight here. It's May, and although it's quite chilly, the sun gives us some warmth. And I will continue the very quotable text by Jacques Derrida. And we had a very nice quote at the end of last session, and speaking of crystallographic analysis that allowed us to know this structure. One thing to look upon, life and death, is the Necker cube. That from one aspect it looks like death, and from another one it looks like life. Trying to put them in opposition makes the both sides of the Necker cube weak, weakening the structure. It is generally a two-faced reality, and the slash or any other way of, so to speak, make sharp distinctions, oppositions in the harshened way, often lead to an attenuated, weakened Necker cube or life. We are fixated with ousia or Einstein and try to see life as an existence out there. Possibly, as indicated by some people, the invention of the definite article made it the life, thereby no longer understanding it's a two-faced thing, and with this misunderstanding actually evicting both life and death from our realm. I will continue the last paragraph. I'm currently now at page 113. The text is thus this time the dominant model. But can we blithely accept this so seemingly straightforward claim? Jacob speaks often of a model, of image, of analogy, of comparison. These are all his words. But before refining my question and coming a bit closer to Jacob's discourse, let me indicate the general form of the problem I would like to pose. Is the text, or is textual language the silent text, since it's always a matter here of a gram that is voiceless? Something determinate that can provide a model for some objective knowledge. without entailing a transformation in the structure of knowledge, in the objectivity of knowledge, in the referentiality of scientific discourse, in the very concept of model, a transformation so complete that the very axiomatic that subtends all these statements would have to be structurally altered. If the object, the referent of a scientific text, and science is text, if the object, the referent of a scientific text, a scientific discourse, if this object and this referent are no longer metatextual or meta-discursive realities, if their very reality has a structure that is analogous to or fundamentally homogeneous with the structure of scientific textuality, if the object, the model, and scientific subjectivity have an analogous structure, namely that of the text, one can no longer speak, as one does elsewhere, of a knowing subject, of one known object, and of an analogical model. Derrida just goes directly to the zest of it, attacking subject in front of object in space. What is more, and for the same reason, what we human beings claim to take from culture as a model, namely discursive texts or computers and everything we believe we know and are familiar with under the name text, what we then claim to take as a model comparison or analogy in order to understand the living at its most elementary level is itself a product of life, of the living, and the alleged model is external neither to the known subject nor to the known object. Deconstruction of the externality. There is nothing fortuitous or external about the living being that we are producing things that might seem to serve as a model for the knowledge of the living. Nothing fortuitous about this analogy of structure. The text is not a third term in the relation between the biologist and the living. And this third term, I'm quite sure, refers to the metalinguistic or metatextual. It is inside the text. The subject and the object are in the text. We are not outside. We're not external. The text is not a third term in the relation between the biologist and the living. It is the very structure of the living as the structure common to the biologist, as a living being, to science, as a production of life, and to the living itself. Since this cannot be said about every region of knowledge. Or about every model or every appeal to model, that the science of the living or the logic of the living is not one region among others in the scientific model, and that there must be therefore follow from his powers and risks that are absolutely unique. He's referring to the uniqueness of this specific area. And that one can no longer speak of this without re-elaborating. As I announced last time when reading Canguilhem, everything that one takes up without any hesitation under the words metaphor, image, model, analogy, etc. So behind it all, there is a modern analogy, or a gestalt, I would say, that affects us to believe of the outsiderness. Having stated these generalities and recall these things, I propose not that we reread the logic of the living, but that we construct with this book, or this discourse or discursive set, of which the book is today an eminent representative, and one that is, as it were, highly distilled. To reconstruct the machine that governs it, quite obviously unbeknownst to it, where unbeknownst means not only unbeknownst to its author, which is more than evident on every page, but unbeknownst to the system, by which I mean not that the system should be conscious or not, but that it does not exhibit and does not put to work certain relations between statements or textual functions. And as a result is not constructed with maximal power and effectiveness. That is, with the power and effectiveness that seem to me possible today. Possibly where and how and why. It is to say this that I would like my response to respond. And he will go into machine here, and there is actually a very interesting Gödelian take here, because what Gödel proved is that there can be no external text that governs everything. The mechanism or the machinery cannot understand itself, and that is not a bad thing. It is the working of it. To think that it could be an outsidedness is to deeply misunderstand, saying something that doesn't make a slightest bit of sense. To construct this machine, one must bring into communication, plug into one another concepts, statements that are detached from one another, and which the force of Jacob's discourse is incapable of bringing together and relating to one another, as if the presence of certain conceptual elements were perceived, though one did not yet know how to make them function, or rather how to analyze them in their functioning. A bit like that deoxyribonucleic acid whose existence had long been detected without anyone being able in the beginning to understand and master its function. Something that could be done only after the progress had been made on all fronts, theoretical, technical, etc. When everything has been plugged in, assuming this works, perhaps we will make some progress in the overall restructuring of the problems that we have been running into from the beginning of this seminar. In particular, those of reproduction, selection, metaphor, concept, this latter problem being localized today in the problem of the model or analogy named text. This has a very close bearing, and I think it would be helpful to think in the terms of Lakoff-Johnson's metaphors of the body and metonymies of the body. When we start to think that the metaphor or the metonymy is some sort of outsidedness to it, that it doesn't bear the embodiment of from where it's coming. As we say often in modern language, it's just a metaphor. Thinking it's somewhere outside of reality, or as Derrida here calls text, we are sort of making a marginalization of the metaphor. As I remember, I had one, we'll be speaking about priest recently, I had one local priest who called Jesus making a couple of fishes and some bread into a magnificent dinner on one of the mountains close to Jerusalem, I think it was. That was a metaphor. But the tone of the voice depicted that he felt it was nothing, it wasn't real. This is not what metaphor means. It means something of the flesh. This is where it gets its strength, and it can actually be incredibly strong. But I think we all have this tendency to put things somewhere in a transcendental sphere. But where is that sphere? It's very close to what in mathematics, and I won't mention this today, something called real numbers. Oddly, these real numbers are the only ones that cannot be situated in the universe. But just the name real tries to make them more real than the metaphors, and I think that's a huge mistake. Also, Barbara Tversky showed that embodied abstract thinking is the strongest of all when it comes to solving problems. And I'm quite certain this is one of the points Derrida is making about the life sciences. That they lose their strength by unbeknownst, as the word was, just accepting this sharp division between life and death. Jacques Monod, who is mentioned later on here, he was definitely one of those biologists who kept that incredible distance. It was really life/death. All life was constructed of death, and then you didn't have life nor death. You had nothing. Nobody has ever managed to make life so dead as Jacques Monod. It is caused not by biology itself or what they discover. Derrida is very much to the point in showing it's caused by this huge chiasm between life and death that makes damage to both of them, make both weak. And as I said earlier in the last lecture, 1540, L and D, left turn, right turn, oddly have the same acronym LD as life and death, are participating in the directionality, which is the life force, or I call it the life force. The living soul, the living body, that perpetuates life in opposition to non-existent, neither will perpetuate. Neither would be chirally twisted. There wouldn't be any bifurcation, as you mentioned earlier. It wouldn't be a choosing of a path. And the choosing of the path, it takes time. So it's the timeless, spaceless vision that, thanks to difference, come yet into existence, become once more alive and vivid, working. To put it briefly and in the most economical way possible, and in order to give today's trajectory, which I like, is a nice word because it shows the direction of the spiral, no doubt that of next week, a relative coherence. Let me state right away that the two conceptual threads, the two conductive wires that I'm going to link together, and these are never linked by Jacob in his book, nor anywhere else, to my knowledge, except perhaps virtually in Nietzsche, in fact, are, on the one hand, the thread or wire that holds together the series image, analogy, comparison, model. And on the other hand, the thread or the wire that holds together this series: reproduction, copy, duplication. When, for example, Jacob refers to these as the very essence of living, these are the two conceptual threads or wires that I'm going to try to plug into one another to see if any current passes them. Death, sexuality, selection will all be part of the program, but as you will see, as supplements follow the logic of the supplement. So we see here life and death are important in the life force. And he does say here, there is a current passing between them. For there to be life in the force, death needs to be present. It's the force. They need to be opposing, but not as with a slash.
What does he say exactly, word by word?
Yes, let me quote here.
Page.
We're on page 83. These are the two conceptual threads or wires that I'm going to try to plug into one another to see if any current passes between them. The current is like electricity. The electricity is the two L and D going in opposite direction but giving the force upwards. It's very close actually to Heraclitus. It's just imagining it. And we see here also, as we said in the beginning of 1540, with machinery and teleology, that they come together, and this model of machinery be first and it produces teleology is too sharp of a division, a chiasm, it's a cleft. Bring them together and see that teleology also comes and produces the machinery, the DNA in this case. Too sharp a division makes them not be able to intermingle, and there will be no current before the sun lapses. I think I put a pause here and Callum. No pause. You can have a comment from Callum.
Okay.
See if I can hold it firmly this time.
Yes, electricity is a very good metaphor. Yesterday I rewatched the interview with the mathematician Wolfgang Smith, who used Niagara Falls and its electricity as a metaphor to explain his preference for the Catholic Church. That is, it has its origin, so to say. Niagara Falls for him was Jesus Christ, and it's transmitted through generations to generations, this electricity, so to say, to Wolfgang Smith. I think it was a good metaphor. And in electricity you have both death and life at the same time. You need the opposing things. And I was thinking, we are here outside in the bloom, so to say, and that makes me think about Harold Bloom, not Alan Bloom, but Harold Bloom, who became famous with his book about the canon of Western literature, that he picked. This book should be in the canon of Western literature, and he emphasized that every text is involved with another text. And here Derrida emphasizes text. So text is the primary thing. Text is a broad term. He uses also DNA. He interweaves in the text, so to say. So you have only every text is dependent on a previous text. So therefore the text is something primary. It's the archetype, so to say. The architect, if I understood him correctly. So in the text you have the everything, the tension, like the electricity, life and death. Myself today we discussed Revelation 3:7 with the textual variants, that is the key of David. Jesus has the key of David, but another manuscript has the key of Hades, key of death against key of life. So David represents life in this context. So it's easy to marginalize the key of Hades because it's a late manuscript. But I would say, if I use Harold Bloom, but also Derrida, is that you have only all the texts of literature goes into one, because no text is silent, it's only interior. Because every author has a dialogue with another text, explicitly or implicitly. So you have only one text, so you cannot say that this text is opposed or is somewhere outside. You don't have any outside texts, because everything is a big structure, archetype, or text is perhaps an excellent term. Nothing is outside of the text, as Derrida said, and text is a very broad term for him. So in that you cannot say that one text is outside, but you have all manuscripts are really one text because they are in dialogue with each other. So you have the opposition already in the text in one way or another. And you need the bacteria coming from the outside. Oh no, it's not outside, it's really, it's both outside and inside in one way. How do we know that? Because if everything is interwoven with each other, you cannot say that one thing is completely outside, because then you create a dichotomy. Because the outside is also inside, as we know from Klein Bottle and Möbius band and so forth and so forth. So I give it back to you, Hans.
Yeah, the text, very good, Kalle. The text, here is the text. And we normally think, me as a reader, I'm outside of that text. The text is here, and the author is somewhere else. We're all part of the text. I interpenetrate, like in the Klein Bottle, or the Russian dolls, as Derrida used here. We used Russian dolls before. And that there is an interpenetration going on constantly. And if I see myself solely as the reader, I take this forehand view of the text. I don't get into it. There is a deep connection here. There is something happening for every time I read. And that is the process of fractality going to fractality. The Norwegian coastline meeting the sea. It's in between it happens. As Terry Mark Starlow said, it's all in the connection. And if you say, oh, I just want to have the Norwegian landmass, as a geologist you will be very, very in bad waters, to use a pun. You need them both, for the understanding comes in between them. Compare that to life and death. Say, I'm only going to have life. It sounds good on the outside, but it's the old estain, it's the old ousia that haunts us here. We want to make it to a thing out there, and thereby distancing us already from the outset, unnecessarily. Go into it, and you will see that you can have life as a life force, but then you will also be able to tell them apart. It goes against the law of the excluded middle, that's true, but it introduces temporality and space, difference, and that heals the text. It heals our understanding and make none of the things less. Both of them become greater and deeper. That's the depth of an extended understanding. Bringing it all in, making it stronger. The sun is disappearing here. We should stop maybe. I say thank you very much. It was one of the most fluent texts by Derrida. Very few parentheses, very few footnotes, and he's here speaking in a quite lucid conference language. I do like it, and it brings a lot of understanding. Thank you very much, Kalle. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you, dear old Jacques Derrida, for your marvelous understanding. Bye bye.
Thank you.